so today we are going to be taking a look at the role of DNA. Again, this assignment is found in 4.8, number 2 in your Google Classroom, of course, under week 10. All right, so as we go through this, you'll be able to fill out your student note catcher. So please do so. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So, this last week, we have looked at the 3 classic experiments that led to the discovery of that DNA was indeed the source of genetic information. So, again, to understand, going back to before Griffin, to understand genetics, we understood that there was inheritance. We understood that there were these things called traits that were inherited from one generation to the next, but we didn't know how it was happening. So, to truly understand genetics, scientists had to understand the chemical nature of these genes. In order to do that, again, we had to look at the 4 macromolecules and the classic experiments from to identify DNA as the molecule for genetic inheritance were done by Griffin. Remember, he did the transformation experiment. Then we had Avery. Avery was the first to identify that DNA was the source of genetic information, but no one believed him. It was very sad. And then we had the definitive work of the team of Chase and Hershey. They did the bacteriophage blender experiments, and they proved definitively that DNA had to be the source of genetic material. So those are our big 3 experiments that we've been looking at this week. Okay, so moving on. So now that we know what the information or that the molecule that carries genetic information has been identified, scientists start to look at how genes and or DNA control the inherited characteristics of living things. So now that we know what is doing it, we now have to figure out how is it doing it? What is the role of DNA? So, the role of DNA. DNA makes up the genes, and therefore it has to be capable of 3 things. The role of DNA in all living things is to do 3 things. Number 1, it has to be able to store genetic information. Number 2, it has to be able to copy genetic information. And finally, number 3, it has to be able to transmit genetic information. And if it cannot do those 3 things, then it can't be DNA, because that is the whole entire function of DNA. That is why DNA exists, if you will. All right, so I always like to call up these 3 functions as being very similar to the way that a book comes to market. So I want to think of like a classic book that's been around since like forever. One of my favorite books that I read when I was in high school was Native Son. So the author of Native Son creates the book, right? He makes the book and he stores his story in his manuscript. Okay? So storing. Then he gives that copy of his manuscript to the publisher, and the publisher makes copies of the book. So it copies the book, just like DNA stores information and then DNA copies information. And then that publisher goes and sells the book and then transmits that story across the whole of the United States, and it becomes a staple in high schools across the nation. Okay, so again, just like DNA, we store information, we copy information, and then we transmit information. And that's kind of like how a book comes to market, and it's also how DNA kind of does its job. So if we're looking at DNA storing information, by the way, this is the primary job of DNA. The most important thing that DNA is going to do, it is going to store all of the information that makes up you. Can remember, genes control everything in your body. How tall you get, how fast your heart beats, the development of your hair color, what skin tone you end up with, whether or not you end up being somebody who is naturally bulky, like you put on muscle really easily, or whether you are somebody who, no matter how much you eat, you kind of stay trim or thin. That is all information found in your genetics. Whether you are predisposed to diabetes, because we all know that sometimes that runs in families. Whether you are predisposed to heart conditions, because we know that runs in families. Um, these are all things that's information in your genes. And all of this information is in your original first cell. Remember, sexual reproduction. Human beings, we reproduce sexually. So once upon a time, there was an egg and a sperm, and they got together and made a zygote. That one single cell zygote was me, was you, was everybody. And that one single cell with all of that information in it eventually developed into the amazing individual that you are. But in order to do that, it had to have all of your information. And that is why the primary job, number one job of DNA is to store that genetic information. All right, the number two job of DNA is to be able to copy that information. So once that zygote gets fertilized, we now know that mitosis is going to happen, right? You start with one parent cell and it creates two perfect copies of itself. And that way we can grow and repair. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about mitosis. So before a cell divides, it has to make a complete copy of every single one of its genes, similar to the way a book is copied, okay? So when we do that, every single piece of information that makes you you has to be copied, because every single cell in your body, every single one, I don't care if it's hair follicle, I don't care if it's a muscle cell, I don't care if it's a lung cell, has a complete copy of your DNA. Now, for many scientists, the most puzzling aspect of how DNA replicates itself is how does that copying get happening, and we are going to be covering that in the next 2 weeks as we look at the structure and function of DNA. But once we understand the structure of DNA molecule, the copying mechanism for genetic information was soon able to be discovered. And again, we'll be looking at that next week and the following week as we get more into DNA. All right. So job number one, store the information. Job number two, be able to copy that information. Job number three, transmitting your information. So when a cell divides, each daughter cell must receive a complete copy of the genetic information. That is if we're going through mitosis and we are doing growth and repair. However, let's not forget about meiosis, right? That makes the gametes, it makes the sex cells. Transmitting information is probably a lot more important in meiosis because, and we remember this, remember disjunction, if there's any problem if there isn't that careful sorting during meiosis, what ends up happening is that the sex cells, the reproductive cells, the gametes, the haploid cells, whatever you want to call them, end up with errors in them. If we lose any DNA information during meiosis because of non-disjunction, that means that that offspring is going to have missing genetic information. And God only knows what information might be missing or maybe might be replicated. But the problem is if a offspring is built with missing genetic information, then that problem, that sort of mistake, if you will, that error in the DNA will then be transmitted on and on and on and on. Not trying to be funny when I say this, and this is actually a true thing. There is a genetic condition, and I'm gonna have to find my article because no one ever believes me when I tell them. But there used to be, I want to say it was Kentucky or Tennessee. There was a single genetic mutation which basically made people's skin blue. And back in the day, people didn't travel as much as we do. So there was an actual whole town of this single descendant of people that basically had blue skin. So they got to be known as like the blue people of Kentucky, or maybe they were the blue people of Tennessee. I have to find the article. It was insane, but it was one genetic mistake that had happened that then got transmitted down the line of all of the following generations, and it was kind of crazy. And you had these blue people. Anywho, so the three most important jobs, the only jobs of DNA: number one, store genetic information; number two, copy that information; and number three, transmit that information to the next generation. All right, so that is about it about that.